Hey guys, tonight we begin with you, an unsuspecting time traveler foolish enough to land in the mud-soaked madness of medieval Europe. Yeah, from castles that leak to peasants that don't. It's a world where chivalry dies faster than hygiene. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. If you're time traveling to medieval Europe, your biggest danger isn't the plague or a sword. It's your shampoo. The moment you show up smelling like coconut or mountain breeze, congratulations. You've just announced to everyone within sniffing distance that you are either possessed, royal, or about to be burned alive for sorcery. You see, in the Middle Ages, smelling bad wasn't shameful. It was normal. The average peasant scent could peel paint. Most people hadn't seen a bathtub, and the ones who did thought water carried disease, which to be fair, it did, but so did everything else. Bathing was viewed as suspiciously sensual. The church decided that sharing bathwater might lead to impure thoughts, which is funny considering no one could even see through the steam and filth. Public bathhouses were eventually shut down for being dens of sin, as if anyone could feel romantic surrounded by 30 naked strangers and an overwhelming aroma of wet cabbage. If you pop out of your time machine freshly showered, locals won't see hygiene. They'll see sorcery. They'll assume you've been blessed or cursed by forces unknown. How do you smell like flowers when you live in a swamp? They'll ask right before calling the nearest priest to examine you with holy water that smells like old soup. So, your first survival step, get filthy immediately. Roll in mud, hug a pig, sleep in hay, whatever it takes. The goal is to achieve that authentic medieval aroma. Equal parts smoke, sweat, and mild regret. You want to smell like someone who hasn't seen hope in 3 harvests. And don't think the nobles were any better. They just covered the rot with perfume. Gallons of it. Imagine roses, musk, and body odor having a knife fight. That's what a medieval banquet smelled like. Their teeth were rotting, their clothes unwashed, and yet they were convinced the real sinners were the ones who bathed twice a month. So remember, your modern cleanliness is a death sentence. You don't want to smell good. You want to smell period accurate. If someone wrinkles their nose at you, relax. That's not disgust. That's acceptance. You finally blended in. And once you smell the part, you'll need to drink something. If you're planning to drink water in medieval Europe, don't. That's not hydration. That's suicide by bacteria. Back then, water wasn't clear. It was a challenge. Every sip was like spinning the plague wheel and hoping it didn't land on explosive dysentery. The average river was a medieval smoothie, a nutritious blend of mud, dead fish, and whatever the guy upstream was dumping into it. And by whatever, I mean human waste, animal waste, and occasionally actual humans. So yes, people drank beer. Not for the taste, not for fun, but because it was the only thing keeping civilization from dehydrating to death. Ale wasn't strong. Maybe 2 or 3% alcohol, just enough to kill germs and your ambitions for the day. It was called small beer, and everyone drank it. Men, women, even toddlers. Picture a 3-year-old stumbling around with a wooden mug, slurring something about grain taxes. That was childhood. Morning, beer. Lunch, beer. Church, light beer, out of respect. Water was so distrusted that if you refused ale, people assumed you were either insane or plotting something. In fact, refusing a drink was borderline heresy. The tavern was the social heart of every village, a place where deals were made, songs were sung, and someone inevitably got stabbed over spilled mead. And before you imagine cozy pubs with polished mugs and cheerful laughter, no. Medieval taverns were sticky, smoky rooms full of shouting men, suspicious soup, and the overwhelming smell of regret. The house ale was usually brewed by someone who measured ingredients using intuition and desperation. If it didn't make you sick, you tipped them extra. Travelers had it even worse. The further you went, the riskier the brew. By the time you reached a new village, you'd be lucky to get something that hadn't fermented into bread. That's why most time travelers in theory would never make it home. Not because of paradoxes, but because of intestinal collapse by day 3. So take my advice. If you find yourself in the 14th century, forget your fancy microfiltered water bottle. Order the ale, say a prayer, and don't ask what's floating in it. In medieval Europe, beer wasn't a beverage. It was life support. Now, if you take one piece of advice from this entire guide, let it be this: don't argue with the church. In medieval Europe, religion wasn't a belief system. It was Wi-Fi. Everyone was connected. No one understood how it worked. And if you lost signal, you were probably going to hell. The church wasn't just a Sunday thing. It was government, news, healthcare, and moral surveillance all rolled into one judgmental package. Every hour of your day belonged to God, and his middle management was everywhere. There were monks counting sins, priests collecting tithes, bishops hoarding gold, and the Pope sitting in Rome like the CEO of Eternal Consequences Incorporated. Now, you might think your modern rational brain can handle this. You've read books. You understand science. Please don't. The moment you say something like, "Actually, the Earth goes around the Sun," congratulations, you've invented heresy. That's a one-way ticket to an audience with a man holding a torch and a very poor understanding of astronomy. Even asking questions was dangerous. If you wondered aloud why prayers didn't cure the plague, you were doubting divine will. If you asked why the priest owned 3 horses while you couldn't afford a loaf of bread, you were testing God. The only safe phrases to say were, "Amen," and "God works in mysterious ways," preferably while backing away slowly. And don't even think about skipping church. Attendance wasn't optional. Bells rang, everyone dropped what they were doing, and off you went to spend 3 hours listening to sermons in Latin, a language nobody understood except the priest, who was usually drunk anyway. If you didn't show up, the neighbors would notice. And in medieval Europe, the neighbors noticed is how every execution starts. The church controlled education, money, medicine, and most importantly, fear. That's how it stayed in charge for 1,000 years. Not by convincing people it was right, but by making sure no one lived long enough to prove it wrong. So, if you time travel back, remember this. Don't debate theology. Don't mention science. And definitely don't say, "I'm spiritual but not religious." They'll think it's Latin for, "Please light me on fire." And if you catch anything, a cough, a rash, or just a vague sense of doom, I have some excellent advice: don't go to the doctor. That's because doctor in the 14th century didn't mean someone who saves your life. It meant someone with a book, a robe, and a hammering sense of confidence. These were men who genuinely believed disease was caused by demons, bad smells, or an unfortunate alignment of Mars and your liver. Their treatments were bold, creative, and catastrophically wrong. Got a fever? You're too hot? They'll bleed you until you're balanced. Feeling weak? You're too cold? They'll set you on fire, metaphorically or literally. If you have a headache, their first solution is drilling a small hole in your skull to let the evil spirits out. The success rate was approximately none. Hospitals existed, but you didn't want to visit them. They were basically waiting rooms for the afterlife. Crowded, loud, and conveniently located next to cemeteries for faster service. Monks ran most of them, which meant half the medicine you received was prayer, and the other half was bleeding you while asking if you'd sinned recently. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, gloves, or the faintest idea of sanitation. Instruments weren't cleaned. They were wiped on the nearest tunic and reused until they broke or screamed. If you survived surgery, congratulations. You now had a new infection to die from. Dentistry was handled by barbers because why not? You'd go in for a shave and leave missing half your jaw. These were the same men who'd also happily amputate your leg and then offer you a discount on a haircut. So if you get sick while time traveling, resist the urge to seek help. Rest, drink ale, and pray to every available deity. It's not that medieval doctors were evil. They were just aggressively confident in centuries of nonsense. Remember, in the Middle Ages, medicine wasn't about curing disease. It was about surviving the treatment long enough to regret it. So, you've made it through the filth, famine, and fever. You've blended in. You smell like despair, and you've mastered the art of not dying. Naturally, you start to think, hey, maybe medieval life isn't so bad. That's your first mistake. Because the moment you relax, something terrible happens. Maybe the harvest fails. Maybe the local baron decides to start a war over a goat. Maybe the sky darkens and everyone starts chanting in Latin because a comet showed up, and clearly that means apocalypse. In medieval Europe, comfort isn't a feeling. It's an omen. You could spend years surviving plagues, invasions, and suspicious bread, only to wake up one morning and discover you're now owned by someone named Lord Geoffrey the Slightly Moist. Your home? His. Your livestock? Also his. Your freedom? Optional. And if you complain, congratulations. You're a heretic and a socialist. Even peace wasn't peaceful. Fires broke out constantly because everything was made of wood and optimism. Floods drowned half the countryside at least once a decade. The rest of the time, people were freezing, starving, or waiting for someone to invent soap. And if you think moving to a castle will help, think again. Castles were basically drafty stone refrigerators full of angry nobles and indoor smoke. You die slower but not happier. Peasants had at least the dignity of freezing outside. The truth is, no one in the Middle Ages was comfortable. They were alive temporarily, painfully, and usually against their will. But they were also stubbornly human, laughing, drinking, singing badly, and finding joy in a world that constantly tried to kill them. There's something admirable about that in a tragic, lice-infested sort of way. So, when you time travel home, do yourself a favor. Take a hot shower, brush your teeth, and marvel at your miracle of indoor plumbing. Then light a candle for the poor souls who never got to complain about traffic or Wi-Fi. Because comfort, the kind we take for granted, is the one luxury nobody in medieval Europe ever truly had. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a half-naked biped staring into the yellow eyes of something with much sharper teeth. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's story together. You wake up 2 million years too early. The air is warm, your brain is small, and the local wildlife is a daily reminder that evolution isn't finished yet. You're standing on the African savanna, naked, nervous, and roughly as edible as a rotisserie chicken without the seasoning. You are not the hunter, you're the unpaid intern of the food chain. Everything around you has fangs, claws, or both. Lions stalk the grasslands, hyenas laugh in the dark, and saber-toothed cats exist for the sole purpose of ruining your day. Your best defense is running, which would work great if you weren't built like a refrigerator on legs. You huddle with your tiny tribe, a dozen equally anxious proto-humans who all look like they just remembered they left the fire at home. Communication is limited to grunts and gestures that all mean the same thing: panic. You spend your days looking for berries, water, and reasons not to die. When you find a carcass, you wait for the predators to finish, then politely pick through the leftovers like a prehistoric janitor. The smell alone could kill you, but protein is protein. At night, you climb a tree, hug a branch, and try not to think about how fragile you are. Down below, the dark moves. Hyenas giggle, lions yawn loudly, and somewhere in the distance, something screams. It's probably Greg. There's always a Greg. And yet, you survive. You start learning patterns: which noises mean danger, which direction the wind blows, and which of your group members can be safely outrun. Eventually, you realize something profound. Sticking together helps, not emotionally, but mathematically. If you're with friends, the odds of you dying go down by at least 1. That's the first spark of humanity. Not art or language, but mutually assured survival. You don't help others out of compassion. You help them because next time it might be you face down in the mud, and it would be nice if someone cared enough to poke you with a stick. Congratulations, you've just invented empathy by accident and under extreme duress. This theory gets its first test run with, of course, Greg. A distant shriek cuts the air, and you see him being dragged into the grass by something large, striped, and uninterested in sharing. The rational part of your brain says, unfortunate, but that's life. The new, weirdly sentimental human part says, we should probably go get him. So, for the first time in history, a group of small, anxious primates does the unthinkable. You run toward the predator. There's no plan, no hero music, just 10 panicking bipeds flinging rocks and screaming incoherently. The tiger hesitates, confused by the sudden burst of stupidity, drops Greg, and bolts. You've just invented the rescue mission. Greg is bleeding and missing a few pieces, but he's alive. You carry him back to camp, share food with him, and take turns keeping him warm. He contributes nothing but bad smells and grunts of appreciation, but when he finally stands again, something changes. You all realize you've cheated nature's rules. You weren't supposed to win that fight. Saving Greg didn't make you saints, it made you stronger. A rescued human meant one more pair of eyes, one more thrower of rocks. From that single act of collective recklessness, humanity learned its first moral lesson. Sometimes survival requires stupidity with a purpose. This new strategy of caring comes with a side effect: anxiety. Now, every rustle in the grass feels personal. You can't relax. But this fear becomes organization. You post lookouts, choose safer sleeping spots, and form noisy semicircles of bravery and bad posture when a threat appears. You haven't conquered fear, you've franchised it. Everyone gets a small share, and it binds you. Then comes the real game changer. Someone throws a stick into the fire and realizes it keeps glowing. Just like that, the food chain gets updated. Congratulations, you've unlocked fire, humanity's first subscription-based safety plan. Suddenly, you're sitting by a circle of light while apex predators glare from the shadows. The campfire becomes your new god. You feed it, protect it, and stare into it like it's Wi-Fi. It's hypnotic. The warmth makes the cold bearable, and the crackle drowns out the night. Around this fire, something magical happens. You start talking, not in words yet, but in noises, gestures, and dramatic facial expressions. You tell stories about hunts, storms, and the time Greg nearly got eaten again. You've just invented storytelling, the ancient art of exaggerating things that barely happened. Around the fire, you become more than a group of nervous apes. You become a tribe, connected not just by survival, but by memory. This new society needs rules, and you invent them through the world's first social contract, the fire watch. You take turns staying awake to feed the flames. It's chaos at first. People fall asleep on shift or accidentally set themselves on fire, but slowly, a system emerges. You start to believe the others will actually do their part. When they say, "I've got it," you close your eyes and let go. For the first time, you experience peace, or at least, light paranoia with a side of warmth. This unwritten agreement, "You protect me, I protect you," expands. You share food, divide tasks, and cover for Greg when he forgets his duties. You're inventing ethics, which is really just teamwork under the threat of abandonment. This budding morality is tested when a boar impales someone you actually like. The smart move is to leave him. The human move is not to. So you stay. You press leaves against the wound, drag him back to camp, and nurse him for weeks. It's inconvenient and statistically bad for your calorie balance, but it works. The more people you keep alive, the more people there are to help you later. Compassion, it turns out, has an excellent return on investment. You've invented basic healthcare without the paperwork. This shift changes everything. Predators start hesitating. They realize that attacking a human means getting swarmed by 10 screaming bipeds throwing rocks like they're auditioning for a band called Panic and the Stones. You're not a prey animal anymore, you're an inconvenience. The dynamic flips. You've changed the game not through strength, but through audacity. Dinner has developed teamwork. You even learn from others. When you meet the Neanderthals, stockier, stronger, and better at surviving, you see they don't just care for each other out of necessity. They bury their dead with flowers and ochre. They have rituals, not just instincts. You feel inspired and slightly jealous. Your tribe starts imitating them, piling rocks over bodies, clumsy but deliberate. You're learning that survival doesn't just mean breathing, it means being seen and remembered. Of course, this new cooperative spirit has a dark twin. Being nice doesn't stop you from starving, so you invent organized violence. You surround a herd, scream, run, throw, trip, and somehow stab something that bleeds. Miraculously, it works. You've killed your first meal as a team. From this day forward, together doesn't just mean let's not die, it means let's kill something bigger than us. The same skills that let you protect better also let you kill better. It's the first time empathy and aggression share the same tent. This system isn't perfect. Compassion has side effects. Saving the weak makes the group slower, feeding the sick drains your supplies. Your tribe splits into team empathy and team efficiency. You argue. Someone suggests ethical abandonment, which sounds sophisticated until you realize it means leaving Greg next time. You don't, of course, but you learn balance. Compassion isn't about saving everyone, it's about saving the tribe. You become pragmatic. You've invented morality, and in true human fashion, immediately turned it into a debate. Through all the running, bleeding, and near-death teamwork, the real secret of survival reveals itself: trust. You learn who shows up when things go wrong, who stands beside you when the hyenas get close. And when you're far from camp, ambushed, and sure it's the end, the person with you turns back. They scream, wave their arms, and throw rocks until the predator retreats. You live. That night, you lock eyes with them across the fire, and something shifts. This isn't just survival anymore, it's connection. Dangerous, irrational, and profoundly human. So, after all this, you finally have your answer. Did early humans save each other from predators? Yes. Constantly, stupidly, heroically. You were soft, slow, and screamingly edible. But you had each other. And somehow, that was enough. You didn't become human by inventing weapons, you became human by inventing rescue. That strange, stubborn instinct to stand between danger and another fragile human is why you're here today, breathing and listening, instead of being another set of bones on the savannah. Turns out, survival was never about strength. It was about sticking together and screaming louder than the lions. High among the rugged mountains and emerald valleys of ancient Iria, women were not merely mothers and wives. They were guardians of mystery, keepers of rituals older than the tribes themselves. Their lives moved with the rhythm of the moon, whose pale light they believed bound them to the divine. When night fell and the mountains turned silver, they gathered in secret clearings, barefoot on the cold earth, to honor the goddess Bindus, protector of water, fertility, and the sacred balance between life and death. The ceremonies began in a silence broken only by the crackle of torches planted in the ground, forming a circle around a basin of spring water that reflected the stars like a mirror. The eldest women, healers and seers whose faces were etched with the wisdom of the mountains, chanted invocations in a language that was never written, only remembered. Their songs, ancient and resonant, called on the moon to bless their wombs, their crops, and their courage. Then, the younger women would begin to dance. Their movements were fluid yet deliberate, echoing the patterns of rivers and wind. A raised hand for birth, a bowed head for the ancestors, a spin for the endless turning of the seasons. They were adorned with charms crafted from bone, bronze, and shells collected along the Adriatic coast, talismans to ward off barren soil, wandering spirits, and the jealousy of rivals. The most powerful of all was a crescent carved from silver or horn, worn close to the heart. It was said this symbol of Bindus herself kept the goddess's favor upon the wearer, ensuring protection through childbirth, storm, and war. Men were forbidden from witnessing these rites. To intrude was to invite divine punishment, or worse, exile. Yet whispers of what happened under the moon spread through the villages like mist. Some claimed the women could summon rain and heal the sick. Others swore that the moonlight itself obeyed their songs. For the Irians, these rituals were not superstition, but survival. The mountains were harsh, the winters cruel, and life was often a fleeting gift. In their sacred customs, the women forged a unity and strength that no sword could break. Under the glow of the moon, they were no longer just daughters or wives. They were priestesses of the earth, bound by song, water, and flame to the spirit of Iria itself. This quiet dominion extended into every facet of life. In the Irian world, fertility was a sacred, celebrated force, bound to the very heartbeat of the tribe. To bear children was to ensure survival, but to conceive under the blessing of the gods was to secure favor for generations. The rituals of spring were acts of cosmic duty, where sensuality and spirituality merged beside sacred wells believed to be touched by Bindus. Women bathed in the cold, pre-dawn water, letting it wash away misfortune and awaken the body's hidden energies. Adorned with wild thyme and violets, their waists tied with red woolen cords symbolizing life's eternal thread, they performed the ancient act of seeding blessings into the heart of the earth. At the heart of this spiritual network was the charm maker, the whisperer of metals and bones. More than an artisan, she was a spiritual engineer. Working alone in a dim hut heavy with the scent of herbs, she would craft amulets from bronze for strength, bone for memory, and seashells for fertility. A young woman about to marry received a beck, a fertility amulet containing a pebble from a sacred river wrapped in her mother's hair. A traveler carried a serpent-shaped charm for protection on the road. Their huts stood slightly apart from the village, both sanctuary and warning. On stormy nights, villagers would see faint lights flickering from within, a sign the women were speaking to the spirits. In Iria, power did not always wear armor. Sometimes, it was a woman by the fire, binding the fates of men with nothing but twine, bone, and whispered prayer. This profound connection to the unseen made women the natural healers, the Vestais or wise ones. Their medicine was a fusion of ritual and remedy. They gathered herbs at dawn, murmuring blessings before cutting any leaf. When a woman fell ill from despair, a common ailment in a world of endless wars, the healer led her to a spring for the water binding. There, she would wash her face, tie a red cord around her wrist, and cast 3 stones into the water, each representing a sorrow to be released. As the stone sank, the healer would sing, Bindus, carry her pain away and return her heart whole. Even the great passages of life, marriage and death, were guided by their hands. A bride was not simply given away, she was reborn. Before her wedding, she bathed in a river at dawn, was anointed with goat's milk and honey, and then, in the privacy of the women's hearth, knelt for the moon oath. Kneeling before a bowl of water reflecting the moonlight, she was bound to honesty and shielded from betrayal by the oldest matron, who traced symbols on her palms with ash. And when a life ended, the women became the guardians of the final journey. They believed the dead lingered for 3 nights, trapped between worlds. The oldest women would cover the mirrors and extinguish all flames but one, the sacred lamp of Bindus, to guide the spirit. They washed the body with spring water and ash, their murmured words a spell of farewell. Then, the morning song would begin, their voices rising in haunting laments that recited the deeds of the departed, keeping the spirit tethered until it was ready to depart. Tears were not a sign of weakness, but an offering, proof that the living still remembered. Long after the Aryan tribes faded into history, swallowed by Rome and reshaped by new gods, the echoes of their women endured. The rituals hid themselves in the folds of peasant customs, in folk songs, and in the secret prayers of grandmothers. The bronze crescents and fish-shaped charms found by archaeologists speak of a goddess whose name was forgotten, but whose spirit lived on. The red threads tied around newborn wrists, the washing of brides in river water, the morning songs sung at funerals, all are ancient gestures, fragments of Iria woven seamlessly into the fabric of time. What made these women remarkable was not their secrecy, but their endurance. They mastered survival by turning myth into daily practice and ritual into rhythm. In their hands, spirituality was carried in baskets, sung over bread, and whispered to rivers. Though their names are lost to history, their presence remains. Every stream, every moonlit clearing, is a quiet reminder. The daughters of Bindus may be gone, but their spirit still moves like water, unbroken, eternal, and endlessly reborn. In ancient Egypt, becoming a pharaoh was not usually something one chose. It was something one was born into. Pharaohs came from royal families, often succeeding their fathers or older brothers. This meant that from a very early age, the future pharaoh was taught how to behave like a ruler. They learned things like reading hieroglyphs, supervising temple rituals, and listening to long meetings with advisors. There were no cartoons. There were no toys. The life of a royal child involved priests, scribes, and many lessons. Most lessons were repetitive and focused on memorizing long lists. For example, the names of gods and how to properly greet each one during ceremonies. Outside, there was sand. A lot of it. The Nile River was the only thing that kept the land fertile. Everything else was dry. Even when it rained, which was rare, it didn't help much. So, most of the kingdom was made of dust, stone, and heat. Palaces were not particularly cozy. They had no air conditioning. There were fans, but they had to be waved by servants. The stone floors were hard and cold in the mornings. The furniture was stiff. Beds were made of wood and cords. Pillows were made from stone. Yes, stone pillows. Becoming pharaoh meant living with rules. Every action was recorded. Every mistake was discussed by advisors. The royal calendar was filled with rituals, processions, and meetings with temple priests. Free time was rare. Even the food was regulated. Pharaohs ate good food, like bread and honey and roasted goose, but not always what they wanted. Sometimes, they had to fast for religious reasons, or eat only certain foods for festivals. From early childhood, pharaohs were told they were gods. But they were also told they could not act like normal people. No running. No shouting. No laughing too loudly. A pharaoh was supposed to act with eternal calm. Even as a child. They were carried in litters, not allowed to walk freely in public. Guards followed them at all times. Their games were often ceremonial in nature. No tag. No hide and seek. Instead, they might pretend to conquer distant lands using small toy boats or chariots, while being watched by stern-faced tutors. The desert sun was harsh. Pharaohs wore elaborate headdresses that were heavy and itchy. Their clothes were stiff with starch. Gold jewelry looked nice, but was heavy to wear all day. Sand got into everything: sandals, robes, hair, and eyes. So, from birth, being a pharaoh was not exactly enjoyable. It was full of responsibility, ceremonial duty, uncomfortable living conditions, and endless desert heat. When a pharaoh's predecessor died, the new pharaoh was expected to become a living god. This was not instant. It took many ceremonies. There were long rituals, some lasting days. The new pharaoh had to go through purification. This meant bathing in cold sacred water and being anointed with oils that smelled strong and sticky. Priests chanted for hours, sometimes in the middle of the night. The coronation process involved standing very still while wearing many layers of clothing. Robes, sashes, belts, headdresses, symbols of power, all worn at once. During the coronation, the pharaoh had to swear oaths. These were memorized in advance. They promised to protect the land, honor the gods, and never show weakness. The oaths were spoken aloud in temples where the air was full of incense smoke. After becoming pharaoh, the new ruler was expected to build things. Temples, statues, monuments. Not personally, of course. But they had to plan them, pay for them, and make sure the gods were happy with the designs. This meant regular meetings with architects and priests. Every temple had to follow rules. It had to face a certain direction, be a certain height, use certain materials. There were no shortcuts. The pharaoh had to approve every detail. There was also the matter of tribute. Neighboring lands sent gifts. Or didn't. If they didn't, it meant more meetings, more decisions. Sometimes war. Being a god meant being perfect. Or at least pretending to be. No mistakes in public. Every sentence rehearsed. Every step guided by handlers. The pharaoh was followed by servants who waved fans, caught flies, adjusted robes, and guarded the sacred sandals. There were also taxes. Pharaohs were responsible for collecting them. Scribes came with scrolls. Farmers complained. Merchants bartered. Pharaohs nodded and pretended to care while listening to lists of grain yields and fish counts. In summary, becoming a god on earth in ancient Egypt was more like becoming a full-time ceremonial manager. The job involved long days, uncomfortable clothing, ritual baths, and many responsibilities. Egyptian religion was not simple. There were many gods. Each god had their own temple. Each temple had priests. Each priest had duties. The pharaoh was expected to visit many temples. Offerings were made every day. Bread, beer, wine, flowers, incense, meat. Statues were washed. Altars were cleaned. Bells were rung. Every offering had to be presented in a certain way. Certain words were said. Certain gestures were used. All of it had to be correct. Pharaohs did not always perform the rituals themselves, but they had to appear to care. They had to watch, or attend, or read about them after. If the gods were angry, floods might come, or not come. Both were bad. Festivals were frequent. They involved processions, long walks through the city while dressed in full regalia. The regalia included gold, beads, embroidered linen, and leopard skins. The heat did not help. Statues of gods were carried through the streets. Priests chanted. Crowds watched. The pharaoh waved slowly, sometimes for hours. Then came speeches. Rehearsed speeches in a formal tone. There was no applause, just silence. Animals were sacrificed. Bulls, birds, goats. This required official oversight. The pharaoh had to make sure it was done properly, with the right knives, at the right time. There were also dreams. Priests interpreted them. If a pharaoh dreamed of a crocodile, it could mean something. Usually, more rituals followed. Religious life took up most of the pharaoh's schedule. Every day included some event related to the gods. If not in person, then through messengers. Temples were cold and echoing. The floors were stone. The walls were high. Torches gave off smoke. There were flies. Being religiously active as a pharaoh meant sitting through many ceremonies, approving many sacrifices, wearing heavy garments, and smelling like burnt incense for days. Pharaohs had to deal with bureaucracy. Egypt had scribes. Scribes kept records. Records about grain. Records about taxes. Records about land. These records were written on papyrus. There were many scrolls. Scribes came in and out of the palace. They brought charts and lists. They read them aloud. Slowly, clearly, carefully. Pharaohs listened, or pretended to listen. There were laws to approve, legal disputes to settle. People appealed to the pharaoh. Disputes over wells, over donkeys, over fence lines. Pharaohs had to listen and decide. There were officials in charge of things: agriculture, flooding, trade, fishing, brickmaking. Every official wanted time with the pharaoh. They wanted to explain their reports in great detail. Pharaohs did not write themselves. They dictated. Scribes wrote, then read back, then rewrote. Slowly. Everything had to be accurate. Sometimes, the pharaoh had to send letters to other rulers. These were written in formal, polite language. They started with long greetings. They ended with long blessings. Nothing could be short. Diplomacy was paperwork. Gifts had to be acknowledged. Marriages negotiated. Treaties copied. The palace had storage rooms, full of scrolls, full of files, full of inventories, dates, names, quantities, all reviewed. If anything was missing, the pharaoh was blamed. So, they had to check, double check, triple check. Paperwork in ancient Egypt was time-consuming. It involved meetings, repetition, and long hours of careful listening. Pharaohs were considered commanders of the military, but they did not always go to battle. Instead, they managed it through long meetings with generals and maps. Many maps. Armies had to be funded. That meant budgeting. Pharaohs talked about copper for weapons, grain for soldiers, sandals, tents, spears, all accounted for. Slowly. Campaigns were planned months in advance. Timing had to align with the Nile flood cycle. Troops could not march through floods. Logistics were detailed. Roads were checked. Supply stations counted. Sometimes, the pharaoh led a ceremonial charge. They rode in a chariot, surrounded by guards. Not too fast, not too bumpy. The sun was hot. Armor was shiny, but heavy. Soldiers shouted slogans. Trumpets were blown. But it was mostly for show. Real strategy came from behind the lines. In tents. With maps and sand tables. Reports came from the front. Daily. Sometimes hourly. Pharaohs read them. Or listened as scribes read. Slowly. Clearly. With pauses. Battles had to be painted. On temple walls. Artists asked many questions. What did the enemy wear? What was the formation? Did the pharaoh look strong? All details were needed. Victories meant writing letters. To gods. To officials. To foreign rulers. Losses meant more rituals. More excuses. More slow meetings. Weapons had to be blessed. Horses had to be named. Chariots inspected. Drills observed. All by the pharaoh or someone in their name. Even at peace, the military needed attention. Soldiers were given farmland. This had to be tracked. Scribes updated rosters. Everything written in duplicate. So, military duty was not exciting. It was long, boring, and filled with paperwork, processions, and ceremonial armor that didn't breathe. Pharaohs did not rule alone. Other kingdoms existed. With other kings. These kings sent letters. And gifts. Many gifts. Diplomatic relations were slow. Messengers traveled for weeks. Sometimes months. They brought carved tablets. Or scrolls. These were read aloud. Word by word. Formal. Polite. Repetitive. Gifts were described in detail. Gold. Ivory. Lapis lazuli. Monkeys. Sometimes dancers. The pharaoh was expected to respond with equal or better gifts. It was important to be generous. But not too generous. Letters always began with long greetings. Describing the health of the king. His wife. His children. His city. The weather. Then came the request. Often for gold. Or a daughter for marriage. Pharaohs did not marry for love. They married for alliances. Some queens came from distant lands. They brought servants. Customs. Complaints. The palace grew more crowded. New languages meant new translators. Translators had their own scribes. Who needed scribes? Every word was checked. Twice. Maybe 3 times. Foreign envoys were welcomed with ceremony. Music. Dancing. Formal bows. Speeches. Long speeches. Sometimes indoors. Sometimes under the hot sun. After the speeches, came banquets. Not for fun. For show. Dishes were counted. Ingredients listed. Guests were seated by rank. Slowly. Carefully. Gifts were exchanged again. Scrolls were signed. Oaths were repeated. In temples. In front of priests. Occasionally, a dispute arose. A missing shipment. A broken promise. This meant more letters. More envoys. More explanation. Always in formal language. Foreign relations took time. Years. Decades. Pharaohs were expected to remember every name. Every gift. Every tiny insult. It was not exciting. It was not dangerous. It was just very slow. Very quiet. Very ceremonial. Pharaohs were known for building things. Temples. Tombs. Statues. Obelisks. But they did not build them personally. They planned them. They funded them. They inspected them. Everything began with a plan. Architects came with scrolls. They unrolled them slowly. They pointed at lines. They spoke in careful, measured tones. The pharaoh nodded. Sometimes asked questions. Mostly listened. Materials had to be chosen. Limestone. Sandstone. Granite. Each had its pros and cons. Quarrying took time. Labours had to be organized. Transport arranged. Blocks floated down the Nile. Scribes kept track of every block, every tool, every worker. Daily reports were made, delivered to the palace, read aloud, corrected, filed. Designs had to follow rules. Temples faced certain directions. Statues had standard poses. Proportions had to be exact. Symmetry was important. Meetings included priests. They gave input about sacred measurements. What pleased the gods? What didn't? Their suggestions were long, often repeated. The building took years, sometimes decades. Pharaohs inspected sites, walked slowly, looked at walls, made comments about cracks, gave approval. Tombs were especially detailed. They had corridors, chambers, traps, all designed in advance. Painters added images. Scribes copied spells. Everything had a purpose. Everything had to be correct. Artisans worked in silence. Precision was expected. Supervisors reported progress daily. Pharaohs listened, or pretended to. When finished, buildings were dedicated, with ceremonies, offerings, chants. Pharaohs wore formal robes, sat on stone thrones, looked serious. Then came the plaques, inscriptions, long lists of titles, accomplishments, written in formal language, with no mistakes. Architecture was not about creativity. It was about tradition. It was slow, careful, repetitive. Pharaohs were considered divine. But they still got sick. There were headaches, toothaches, fevers, rashes, stomach problems. They were treated with ancient medicine. Doctors were called sunu. They carried scrolls with remedies. Ingredients included garlic, honey, mud, sometimes crocodile fat, sometimes crushed beetles. Treatments were slow. Some took days. Some involved prayers. Others required rituals, or chanting, or wearing amulets made of bone. A stomachache might be treated with figures, and beer, and a warm compress, applied by a servant, every hour, for a whole day. Toothaches were common. Pharaohs ate a lot of bread. Bread had sand in it. Grinding grain with stone tools left grit. Grit wore down teeth, caused pain, infection. Dentists did not exist, but doctors tried. They applied paste, smelled bad, tasted worse. Pharaohs endured it, silently. Priests offered cures too, magical spells. They said the pain was caused by spirits, or gods, or curses. So they performed rituals, waved incense, sprinkled oils, said long prayers. Minor injuries were treated with honey. It had antibacterial qualities. Sores were wrapped, changed daily, reported to the scribes. Serious illness required isolation. The pharaoh stayed in special rooms, with special guardians, with special food. Everything noted. When all else failed, sacrifices were made. Animals, bread, beer, all offered to the gods, hoping for healing. Old age brought more problems. Arthritis, weak eyesight, fatigue. There were herbs, and hot baths, and more spells. Being a pharaoh did not prevent sickness. It just made it more ceremonial, and very slow. Pharaohs had families, large ones, wives, children, half-brothers, cousins. They all lived in the palace, or nearby. They all had needs. Wives had ranks. One was the great royal wife. Others were lesser wives. Then came concubines, and their children, who wanted titles, attention, food. Family life was not private. Servants were always near. Guards too. Conversations were overheard. Every word could be repeated, misunderstood, documented. Children were raised by tutors, not by parents. They learned math, writing, religion, manners. Some wanted to be priests. Others wanted to be generals. Most wanted to be noticed. Royal dinners were formal. Seating was assigned. Bowing was required. Every dish served in order. No loud talking. No laughing. Just eating. And nodding. Jealousy was common. Some sons wanted the throne. Some wives wanted favors. Everyone wanted land. Land meant power. Land meant taxes. Pharaohs listened to complaints. From sisters. From sons. From mothers. Each complaint came with a scroll, a servant, and a suggested solution. Divorce was rare, but not impossible. It involved rituals, declarations, and sometimes a statue being removed from a temple. Royal funerals were also complex. When a family member died, mourning rituals began. Black robes, ashes, chants. It lasted days, sometimes weeks. Gossip was constant. Who was favored? Who was not? Who received gifts? Who was ignored? Palace life was busy and full of rules. Even in the family, pharaohs had to act formal, respectful, distant. The divine could not be casual, not even at home. Family did not bring peace. It brought schedules, protocol, and more meetings. Eventually, every pharaoh died. It was expected. It was planned for. Years in advance. Tombs were prepared. Supplies gathered. Texts copied. All very slowly. Death was not the end. It was a transition. From ruler to divine being. The process began with mummification. A long process. 70 days. Sometimes more. Organs were removed. Carefully. Placed in jars. Called canopic jars. The body was dried. With natron. A kind of salt. Then wrapped in linen. Hundreds of layers. Amulets were inserted between layers. For protection. Each had meaning. Each had a place. Nothing was rushed. Funeral priests recited spells. Many spells. Some from the Book of the Dead. Others from older scrolls. Each line had to be correct. Misreading could cause problems in the afterlife. When the body was ready, it was placed in a coffin. Sometimes multiple coffins. One inside another. All painted. All labeled. The tomb held items for the next world. Furniture. Food. Games. Statues. Sandals. Even wigs. Everything labeled. Everything listed by scribes. The burial procession was formal. Slow. Silent. Priests led the way. Relatives followed. Officials watched. The coffin was lowered. Doors sealed. Rituals ended. But the work continued. The name of the pharaoh had to be remembered. In temples. On walls. On statues. Scribes copied it. Over and over. Every year, festivals honored past pharaohs. Offerings were made. Incense burned. Names spoken aloud. Memory kept alive. Some pharaohs were forgotten. Others erased. Their names chiseled out. Their statues broken. Still, the tombs remained. Covered in sand. Found centuries later. In the end, the pharaoh's legacy was stone. Dry air. And a long story. Recorded carefully. Repeated quietly.